you run the publication that has been more correct than any other conservative publication on foreign policy for the last 20 years. You yourself are a pretty prominent foreign policy reporter in your own right. How goes the war? What's going to happen?
The Ukraine war?
Yeah.
I think Ukraine is losing pretty badly. I think Russia had a bad 2022, to put it mildly. I think both things can be true. So the Russia Super Bowl case was just wrong in 2022. That doesn't.
Can you explain that? What was the Super Bowl case?
I think that a lot of people, I think most people subscribe to the Russia Bowl case. I didn't have a firm view on it. You have to really find. I don't think you can find me saying anything on it. I think there was just an assumption that they would roll into Kyiv and just take the place, and that is wrong, and did not occur.
Did they try to do that?
They were bombing Kyiv in a way that was menacing and targeted in a way that seemed like they might. And then there have been all these isolated reports, but it's Eurasia, so just don't believe any of the reports. But there have been reports about assassination, kill squads to get Zelensky in the winter of that year. But just because the first year was a mess up for the Russians, a lethal mess up, doesn't mean that that's the end game. Doesn't mean that's the trajectory that the war would end on. And I think a lot of people are really stuck in 2022 on that. And I think meanwhile, the Russians have been able to eke out gains, and they have the whip hand, because the Ukraine thing doesn't really actually make any sense. It doesn't. The case doesn't make sense for why it's American interests. And if it really is in the European interests, they're certainly not spending money in a way that, if you think if something was literally an existential threat, you would think you would spend 3% of your money on.
So tease out the European dynamics.
If I thought I was going to die,
yeah, I
think I would spend 3% of my net worth on it. And the Germans can't do that.
Yeah. So tease out the European dynamics here. What do the French want? What do the Germans want? What exactly is going on in Europe? Because I think that from an American vantage point, and especially the special, unique order, low bar for sophistication that I would assign American conservative media, Europe is monolith. But obviously these countries have different, distinct and disparate interests. What exactly are the dynamics going on the continent, and how are they playing out either for or against the Ukrainian interests in this war?
You're saying the conservative monolith take is that European. So
people don't pay attention. They don't know anything about Europe.
Right. Okay. So I think that we essentially have fairly archetypal governments in the four capitals that truly matter in Europe. And so in London, you have, I think Sunak is actually relatively reasonable, but in general, he basically heads a party that behaves like a British Conservative Party does, which is to say, they kind of LARP at being an empire. They are often more hawkish than Washington, and are just perplexing and weird. But that's a very real thing that they do. Boris Johnson, the former prime minister, was a comical caricature of this dynamic before his party sagely removed him from office. But I think that's basically the British position. I think the French are essentially especially Macron is also a parody of a French prime minister. President. He is returning to type, which is that France sees its, I think rightly sees its killer app on the international scene as diplomacy, and so France is trying to insert itself as a major player in any negotiation. And then B, they are one of the more dovish major countries in Europe on the Russia matter. I think Macron and Putin. I think Macron earnestly tried to avoid a war, which he was mocked for, but I don't know, maybe it would have been better if we didn't do this war. I think hundreds of thousands of Russians and Ukrainians might agree. And so I think that's essentially the messaging out of Élysée, and especially because Macron is term limited. He pretty much can't run in 27. There is isolated reporting that he thinks that's dumb and would like to run it in 27. But
that'd be cool.
Yeah.
I want to see that.
Yeah. Berlin, it's so it's a little confusing, but the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, which is probably vaguely to the left of where the Democrats are now, although obviously don't have it's sort of Germany's different culture than America. That party has traditionally been the more dovish party on Russia. The last SPD chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, was like a lobbyist for Putin, and he's on a board of several Russian companies. Yeah, fascinating.
He's chairman of Gazprom, right?
Yeah. Chairman of the board, not the head of it, but that's and so I think there was this weird situation where Scholz really felt he had to like prove that he wasn't weak, and so accordingly German policy was more hawkish than expected, perhaps because of also he's in a coalition essentially of like extreme normie libertarian people on the one hand, and then that it's called the FDP, and then he's also in coalition with the Greens, who have become weirdly hawkish on Russia. Also, Russia's a sort of petro state, so that makes sense. But that's actually a shift in policy. And then Italy, finally,
is it because it's the only Green Party in Europe that the Russians don't fund? Because they fund the center left party.
I don't know the exact dynamics of funding of. The last Russian fund, the most famous, notorious financing of a political party in Russia was the political party by the Russians in Europe, was the loan that they gave to Le Pen's party in the mid-2010s, which they've never lived down, even though in theory it's a loan, they just pay back. But perhaps find another bank. But and then I think Meloni was the sort of like same thing with Scholz, which is like she felt Meloni in Italy felt that because she was seen as the Russia sympathetic, that she had to go completely the other direction. But I think like if you're like a Margaret Thatcher impersonator, which exists in Britain, they
exist here.
They do. And I think you don't feel great about the governmental constructions of France, Italy, and Germany. Like the leaders like don't believe in this stuff at all. And then even the British Prime Minister doesn't, I think, uber believe it within the ranks of the Tories. And so, it's a nasty setup. I think in Biden.
And so the only reason they stick to it is because it's largely costless.
Why do they stick to it?
Yeah. If they're all shaky.
I think, I mean, I don't want to like imply like extreme cynicism here. I think there is like an actual view that like they believe their own propaganda, which is like if Putin is allowed to take Donetsk, that's the same thing as Hitler taking Warsaw, and like it'll just be an endless Manichaean world of people just. I think people actually believe he's going to like invade Poland, and like that will be allowed, which I think is laughable. Like the United States has Article 5 treaty obligations to Poland. We don't seem exactly trigger shy. I think if Putin tries to invade Poland, we're going to war. So I think it's sort of like a non sequitur, but yeah.
Yeah, it's always 1939 to these people, right. You know? So why is that? This is something interesting that I actually haven't seen a lot of people talk about. Like, why is that not the case? Why is it not, aside from Article 5, why is it not 1939?
Well, I mean, just like 90% of all movies ever made are about Hitler. So, I mean, it's just like,
it's kind of in the zeitgeist.
Yeah, sort of in the zeitgeist. Why is it not the case? Because the Russian Federation is trying to subsume parts of a state that didn't exist independently and existed within their own borders within my lifetime, not yours. Soviet Union existed when I was born. 33. And so, status quo ante, there was extreme sympathy in the East towards Russia. And there are Russian speakers in Ukraine. The counterpoint is like, it's the same justification that Hitler made. There's a guy who speaks German in this country. We're invading him. And so, yes, okay, fair enough. But I just think it seems ludicrous. And also simultaneously, it reminds me of this sort of arguments, and I think it's public record, I'm not a fan, but like the caricatures of George W. Bush, was that he was both horrendously stupid and evil and all powerful. And so, like, what is it? The Russians are getting bogged down in a quagmire in Ukraine, or Putin is just he's going to march into Paris. Like, I think you have to pick a lane.
Yeah. How do you think the war is going to resolve, and specifically, what do you think a common source of endless amusement for both of us, Joe Biden, thinks about said matter?
Yeah. Well, I got a piece that'll come out in a few weeks in the Critic, where I basically said what I've been saying for a while. I think there's an underrated chance of a ceasefire, which is short formally of an armistice, but I think there's also an underrated chance of an armistice this year. I think the rationale is fairly clear. Putin can wait and see on the result of the election in 24. And Biden can cut his losses, unless Biden is insane to think, unless Democrats convince themselves that Ukraine is an asset in the election. And I just don't think it is. I think it's actually very similar to 2004, where public opinion was sort of neatly divided. There was probably enough people that could, net be bullied into doing the default position of the U.S. government at the time, but that the anti-war thing was actually highly motivated to the anti-incumbent party. I submit that Trump, the former president of the United States, is a more formidable candidate than Mr. Kerry was in 2004, and that Biden is potentially a weaker candidate than George W. Bush was in 2004. So I think it makes sense, and Biden has tried in politics a long time. I think it makes sense to remove motivating factors against his incumbency. And then, what was the second question you asked? Sorry.
Well, what do you think he wants?
Biden?
Yeah.
I think Biden has sort of weaved throughout the Democratic vortex. He's never been an extreme anything hawk of hawks. Yeah. But he has voted for a lot of foreign policy interventions, and he's been very, very careful. Biden never leaves the Democratic establishment. And so, with the exception, I think, of Afghanistan, where he produced the 4 days of his presidency where there appeared to be like a person with views and passions. I mean, you think what he wanted, the Afghanistan thing, but I mean, like his speech in the treaty room, his speech defending the withdrawal after the bombing at the Kabul airport.
He wanted 60 Minutes. They were like, so what about girls in schools? And he's like, not in our national interest.
Right, yeah, like he seemed to like have like passion and views on it.
The meds were really hitting that week.
Yeah. It was the ketamine.
Yeah. I will say in 20, if you saw him on the campaign trail in the primary before COVID, it does seem like I'd always sort of deluded myself into thinking perhaps he was more rational on the Russia thing. He does seem to harbor some of these extreme Russophobic tendencies, not nearly as much as Clinton would or other Democrats, potentially enough. Again, I'm not a stalwart in thinking this is a extremely important macro issue, but there is the question of what exactly Biden's relationship was in Ukraine. How is that biasing the administration's handling of this? But that said, I mean, Biden met with Putin in 21, and it seemed like all business. I think this is certainly among the more moderate Democrats one can imagine in this position. And I think he has the political capital and capability to cut a deal if he wants to. I think we both have violated the first rule of Fight Club.
Did you ever wear a tie?
On the West Coast, is it truly best coast?
I think if she wants the nomination in 28, she is going to be the nominee.
First time you were on the show, you predicted the economy was going to crash. What is the up-to-date, hot off the presses 2024 doomsday prediction from one Curt Mills?
Bengali Uber driver in like late October 2020, and I'm not going to do a Bengali accent. But people are really underrating that he's going to be on the ticket in 24 in my view. I think he's a definite dark horse.
You think Gavin Newsom is overrated? The most
We're
overrated
way
person?
over our 10 minutes.
He is far and away the most overrated Republican in national life.
To wrap up, we're trying something new for season 4. We're going to be doing a segment of this show that is just for our paid subscribers on YouTube. If you'd like to join up, you can be either a truther or a statesman. These are the 2 levels. Go to YouTube. You can see we spend a lot of money on like putting 4K cameras up and editing it all together and everything. So we're trying to steer some traffic to the YouTube show and reward our power listeners. And so during these segments, we're going to be talking about interesting personal anecdotes, getting people to predict the doom of the world, that kind of thing. And so Curt and I are both afflicted with a particular disease of the horological variety. We like watches, so we're going to talk about that and a manner of other things. I'm going to ask him why he thinks the world will end or how it will, kind of like he predicted the economy was going to crash last time, and then it did. So go to YouTube and join as a truther or statesman. But Curt, you and I, by sheer volume, we end up discussing watches more than any other.